Greetings and welcome. My name is Don Alexander. I'm President and Managing Director of GeneCoda Executive and Professional Search. We connect outstanding firms in the life sciences sector with executives who help bring game-changing products to the market. I'm pleased to be joined here today with Barry Buzogany, an advisory board member of our firm. Barry is a professional board director and former C-suite executive for both public and private pharmaceutical, life sciences, med tech, and contract research organizations. Barry is currently serving as director on select advisory and statutory boards to share his wealth of leadership experiences, extensive domain knowledge, and lessons learned as an accomplished operations and legal executive and entrepreneur. Welcome, Barry.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thanks, Barry. In this video series, Barry and I will be discussing the functions of corporate and advisory boards, including the legal and practical differences and pros and cons of each, why consider a board of directors or advisory board, and when is the right time, how to form a board and criteria for selecting board members, and how to compensate board members of the board of directors or advisory board. In today's discussion, we'll learn about how to compensate a board of directors and advisory board members. Barry, what can you give us regarding an overview regarding the compensation of a board of directors or advisory board?
Sure. Overview is a good word because it can certainly vary. Compensation packages can vary with the type of company we're speaking of, the life cycle of that company. Obviously, companies as they move along the maturation process and move into profitability and so forth, the compensation of boards can vary along with the revenue model for the company itself. But in terms of making sure as a board that you are using good practices and you sort of fit in with the rest of the world out there, it's always good to continually benchmark what your compensation package is once it's developed, to continue to look at that. That's why, for example, many companies have compensation committees who are charged with looking at that. But typically, in terms of what generally is used, it's the comp package is generally made up of cash and or equity, and that can vary, certainly. In some cases, certainly, as I say, both cash and equity. Some other companies, especially those who are maybe public companies or larger in size, will offer other benefits besides cash and equity, perhaps a pension option and so forth. But we ought to speak primarily, I think, of cash and equity, particularly since there's been a trend, I think, an evolving trend over the last decade or two to moving strictly on to cash and equity on the part of many companies. In part, that was generated from a report, a blue ribbon commissioned report commissioned by the NACD, National Association of Corporate Directors, which is a national organization for professional director development, which I'm a member of, in fact, sit on the local chapter board. And they came out with a report in 1997, I want to say, that really seemed to strike a chord over time, because they had recommended that cash plus equity is probably a good way to go. And in fact, they went on to say that the equity piece should be at least 50% of the total value of the comp package. So those were recommendations that, again, have made an impression over the years, apparently, because they're citing a trend to just that. Compensation packages are made up of cash and equity. They're doing away, for example, with some of the other perks or benefits like a pension option. Those seem to be going away. So again, it's a matter of benchmarking what the best practices are for your company, and we'll talk about some sources you can go to help you with that benchmarking effort. But if we move over to the advisory board side, as you're forming an advisory board, obviously one of the early questions you have is, well, do we compensate or do we not compensate our advisors? And there's no standard scheme, as you might suspect, for that either. it can vary and depend greatly on the type of company and so forth. So there again, you really have to benchmark. And if you are forming a newly formed advisory board, then you could Google it. You could go on Google and say, how do I compensate a board of directors or an advisory board? There's a lot of information out there, articles and data that will help you benchmark what's appropriate for your company and its advisors in your part of the country and your industry and so forth. Now you should always cover expenses regardless of the other comp options. Advisors expect to have any expenses they incur covered, whether it's, you take them out to lunch and you cover that, or whether it's you've asked them to travel and so forth. And there are a lot of companies out there that don't offer any compensation for their advisors. I've been on some of those, and that's okay. In fact, I like to say free is good. Sometimes people coming on and are willing to help the company and share their expertise are happy to do so without compensation. So that is something to consider. Now, if you are compensating, then typically, again, we're looking at stock or stock options for advisory board folks. I prefer options because stock has its tax complications. And so one way to consider, okay, how many shares of options should we consider? You can use a formulaic approach and say, well, if my executive team, if you're the CEO or the chairman of the board who's forming this advisor group, if my executive team is making 10 to 20%, let's say, of the total available outstanding shares, fully diluted as equity, then maybe my board of advisors should be making somewhere in the 1% to 2% range. I mean, that's one way to look at it, sort of in a formulaic way. And again, but you can do your own homework and do your own benchmarking to see what else looks to be in practice out there and making sense for your particular company. And again, there are companies out there that pay advisors cash and only cash. So that's why I say it varies. Now, if you're, in terms of type of company, if you're a company that generates cash, and that's your business, a cash generating business versus, for example, a capital appreciation play, you probably want to compensate your advisors in cash. Okay, so that's one example of how the type of company can affect your decision. Now, I've said in previous videos that we should also, for our advisors, have an advisor agreement for each of the members, and you would want in there to have a fixed term, maybe 2 to 3 years, and renewable at the end of that term. Make sure you have a vesting schedule for those options if that's what you're offering. An accelerated vesting clause in case there is an M&A down the road before those options fully vest. So those are kinds of typical provisions you would put in an agreement that speak to compensation. Now, I would also say, though, that even if there is no compensation for advisors, there is a lot of intangible value to be had as an advisor. It certainly can expand your network professionally. It can give you additional board experience as you move on into other boards perhaps in the future. And there are many people sort of like me who enjoy just being mentors and sharing their knowledge with companies of interest. And so they're happy to be helping out without giving consideration to being compensated. I mentioned before that I had, in a startup company that I was with, a drug development startup, we had medical advisors who were clinicians helping us for a couple of years without compensation, and they were terrific, helping us with clinical design. I think by about year 3, we started to offer them options, but they never asked, and that wasn't why they were there. They believed in what we were doing and were glad to share their expertise. So I think if that's helpful, that's kind of top line focus.
That's fantastic, Barry. And certainly many of the points that you just made are very salient to membership on the board of directors for a nonprofit, which doesn't prototypically offer, any type of cash or equity remuneration. It's my understanding. So some of those other attributes certainly hold true or ring true in that type of circumstance. So you've been talking a bit about benchmarking so far here, and certainly Google, is a resource, but are there additional resources, or if so, what might be available to help companies determine what compensation might be?
No, there really are. There are a lot these days, particularly because of the internet. I mean, you really can, just by Googling how do I compensate a board, and come up with more information than you care to read, perhaps. But a lot of it is very good, put out by credible sources. But beyond that, there are other organizations out there besides the NACD that are there to offer their help. There are certainly compensation consulting groups that, if you have the budget for it, who can be extremely helpful in benchmarking your compensation program. And they're good to tap into, by the way, over the years, again, as you make sure some years out that you are continually benchmarked to the appropriate level of compensation for your firm, your company. I would say too, though, that as I mentioned before, the trends have been changing and evolving a bit in terms of compensation. There's a lot more scrutiny these days, if you will, on board compensation. So it's all the more reason to be diligent in your benchmarking and doing it, occasionally, because you have, over the years, you've had laws come into play, Sarbanes-Oxley and Dodd-Frank, and as a result of some of that, there's a lot more shareholder activism out there. So the whole subject of compensation for boards of directors, at least, should stay on the front page of your list of to-dos to stay up on, so to speak. As far as NACD, I would just want to mention that is a good organization for directors and aspiring directors. And so if you go to NACD, NACDonline.org, you can read about them. And there are a few other organizations out there that are somewhat similar to them, but a very good resource for the kinds of things we're talking about now if you become a member. But again, you can pay for some very reputable firms out there that are comp consultants and do your own homework online.
Excellent, excellent. And so when we think about boards in particular, we think about different committees or committee service. And I guess the question is, we think about audit committee, governance committee, whatnot. Does the board member compensation, I guess, differ within the structure of the committee?
Yeah, that's a good question, because it certainly can vary and differ from simply the board compensation coming in as a board member, because committee members for boards of directors are an important function, especially if you're a public company and you're governed by federal and state laws and regulations with respect to how you govern your organization. So those board members who might join, for example, an audit committee or a finance committee, are spending additional time, after all. And those committee accountabilities and responsibilities are becoming more and more important in today's regulated environment, again, with the shareholder activism as well. Excuse me. So it's an important piece. And so typically there will be additional compensation, maybe for the chairman of those committees, because, again, of the additional time invested that it requires. So on the other hand, I have, again, this goes back to NACD in a 2019 article that was written about trends in compensation more recently. And they're making the point that boards of late seem to be streamlining and simplifying their compensation packages. So so the use of committee compensation, for example, is kind of on the downtrend. Rather, the compensation is all wrapped into the overall package, as opposed to additional comp for committee service. So that's kind of a trend that I'm reading about, and again, the trend is moving away from any other benefits besides cash and options or stock. So So to answer the question simply, yes, the comp can differ with board service and committee service, and you have to be, again, particularly these days. I think the committee service is getting more complicated and requiring more time. So one way or the other, whether it's sort of upfront in your comp package or whether it's a separate comp piece as the chair of a committee, it's important to have that in place.
That's fantastic. Now, we know in for-profit companies that, equity is often part of the package offering, I suppose. But I guess the question that comes to mind is, should board members also be shareholders?
Well, in one way, the question could be put: does a bear sleep in the woods? Because the answer is a ringing yes. They should be, because they will be if they are major investors, either they or a representative of them or their firm, be they venture capital, private equity, whatever they are. If they are a significant investor, then yes, they're going to want representation on the board. After all, they have a vested interest in the investment they make, and they want to protect that along with that of the other shareholders in that company. So the good news is, not only though are they investors for your company, but if they are sophisticated investors who come in, you want them on your board or a representative on your board, because they bring good governance. These are investors who know all about the again, federal and state regulations that apply and give them accountability as fiduciaries, right? So it's a good idea to have them on your board for that reason alone. And I did see a couple of surveys about early stage companies, because so far I've been really talking about boards of directors. But early stage companies, in that environment, I read that for one survey says that early stage companies with investor directors, because that's what we're talking about here, is investor directors, those companies seem to perform better. And the survey said they tend to raise more money than otherwise. They tend to raise money from professional venture investors. They're more likely to recruit a quality CEO. Their IP portfolio tends to do better. And importantly, they're likely to reach the IPO stage. So it's interesting that when you hear advantages like that of having an investor director on your board. But one other survey I'll point to, and I'm sorry I don't have the source for that either, but it says that 31% of early stage companies, and these are usually startup to what you consider early, 31% have outside directors, but only 1/3 of those are investor directors, so about 10%, right, of early stage companies. But as you move along the pendulum, growth stage companies have more than 50% investor directors, and late stage, still startups, but late stage startups are 2/3 or 75% are investor directors on those boards. So I thought that was an interesting bit of statistics as well. So again, the answer to your question about whether they should be on the board is a resounding yes.
That's great, Barry. Those are some interesting statistics as well. This has been a really great series, and we appreciate your time and insights.